The origin of Christmas is not what you've been told. Is Christmas a holy day or a holiday that has been stolen? If December 25th is not Jesus' birthday, then whose birthday is it? Welcome to the Fight for Truth. This is part of our Air Power series where we deal with different topics succinctly and clinically. And I'm your host, IK, and we're going to be delving into this topic of Christmas. And as we pondered on this topic, there's a lot of fanaticism around this topic. There's a lot of weird ideas and extreme ideas, but we're going to be giving you a balanced view on the topic of Christmas. So Christmas, should we celebrate it? Where did it come from? Okay, so we're going to start our history looking at Genesis chapter 10 and verse 8. Now, just after the flood, one of Noah's sons, you have Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So from Ham, you get Cush, then you get Nimrod. Now Nimrod, it says here, he was a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Apparently this man was so strong, he was able to wrestle a lion and kill it. He was a black man, an African man, and he was a powerful man. And he was the leader of the rebellion. He had Babel and other cities, but in Babel was where he built this tower. Now the concept was that God had told his people to spread through the earth and multiply and fill the earth. God was not in favor of cities, right? But Nimrod built a city, and all these people gathered in this city under his rule. And they thought, well, just in case God decides to send another flood, we're going to protect ourselves and we're going to build this tower. And if you know the story, their language was confused, so they couldn't communicate, and that was the end of the building of that tower. Now, where that tower was built is actually where later on Babylon was built, and Babylon came from the Assyrian Empire, right? So this is the original spot where Babel was and Nimrod were. Now, why are we talking about Nimrod? Now, Nimrod, his father Cush, was married to a woman. Her name was Semiramis. After Cush died, Nimrod married Semiramis, which is very, very wrong and very strange. He married his mom. And then they had a baby. That baby was called Tammuz. Now, as we mentioned, that later on Babylon was where this spot was built. In Babylon, ancient Babylon, you had the Ishtar Gate. Ishtar is the same as Semiramis, and the Ishtar Gate was to do with fertility, the goddess of fertility. And Ishtar was celebrated sometime around March-ish, which is interesting because that's where the concept of Easter came from. So you have Ishtar in March, and then 9 months later, you have Christmas, which is Tammuz, his birthday. So Christmas, the 25th of December, is actually the birthday of Tammuz, right? So so it makes you wonder, well, if these were clearly pagan established deities, why were they then later on Christianized? You know, you have, for example, where the modern day Vatican is, it used to be an ancient pagan temple. In fact, there's a statue of Peter in the Vatican, and that statue is older than Peter, because what they did was they took the statue of, I think it was Mercury, and they said, we're going to just Christianize it and call it Peter. So this is what we call baptized paganism, and this started in the 300 ADs under an emperor called Constantine. Constantine had a bit of a kind of conversion sort of experience. He forced his soldiers to be baptized. He felt he had an encounter with God, and he wanted to combine paganism with Christianity. And under Constantine's rule is where we see all these things taking place. Some of the things that took place, like we've talked about here, is Ishtar becoming Easter and being used to celebrate the death of the Messiah. And then you have Christmas, which is the birthday of Tammuz, and they said, well, why don't we use it to celebrate the birthday of Jesus? And there were other things that took place. For example, if you know of the saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, there was a pastor and his name was Ambrose. And so Ambrose, he had two churches, one church in Milan and one church in Rome. Now at the time, all the Christian churches were Sabbath-keeping churches. They all kept Saturday as a day of worship. So when he went to Milan, he kept Sabbath or Saturday. When he went to Rome, he kept Sunday. So his parishioners, the church members, they were confused. They said, well, Bishop Ambrose, when you're with us, you keep the Sabbath on Saturday. But when you go to Rome, you keep Sunday. Why is this? And he said, well, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And that's not a Bible verse. That's a concept of compromise. So we see here compromise being a heavy doctrine under Constantine's influence, where he said, we're going to stop persecuting Christians. We're going to bring the pagans and the Christians together. We're going to worship on the Sunday, right, instead of the Sabbath. And we're going to Christianize Tammuz's birthday. We'll call it Jesus' birthday, Christmas. And we'll also do the same thing with Easter and so forth. Now, some people look at that and say, well, it's wrong, so we're not going to have any part of it. If you choose to do so, that's fine, because we all have free will. But the issue is not that. The issue is, as it says in Matthew 15, you make God's commandment of none effect by putting your traditions above God's commandment. Matthew 16 brings this out as well. In vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrine the commandments of men rather than the commandments of God. So the issue is not that these things have been introduced. As we saw previously, these are time monuments now. The issue is what we're going to see as we look at some verses in the Bible. Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north. And behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. So the Bible mentions Tammuz, which was the child that was born on the 25th, but it's not in a positive light. They were weeping for Tammuz. They were worshiping. Israel was in apostasy and they were worshiping Tammuz. The women were weeping for him and baking cakes for him, rather than putting their worship towards God. That's what the issue is. We'll see that again in Jeremiah. It talks about how they would cut a tree out of the forest, and they would deck it with silver and with gold and all these things, and they would secure it in a place. Now, some people have said, well, this looks like what we call the Christmas tree. So the Christmas tree was purely pagan, so we shouldn't have anything to do with it. But is that what the issue is? Because you read further down, it says, but they are altogether brutish in verse 8 and foolish. The stock is a doctrine of vanity. So it's talking about a doctrine, right? The doctrine of false worship. And as you keep reading, it goes into them. It says, but the Lord is the true God. He is the living God and an everlasting King. At his wrath the earth shall tremble and the nations shall not be able to abide his indignation. So the issue here is that these people carved out the tree, and as they carved out the tree, they decked it with all these ornaments, and then they worshipped it. Okay, now what does the Bible say about this? Well, in Romans, first of all, in Romans chapter 1, it tells us that we should not represent the Godhead. Actually, in Acts 17, it says, for as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold or silver or stone graven by art and man's device. Godhead is talking about God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So we shouldn't represent God or the Godhead with art or man's device. This could be a carving, this could be an image or a picture, right? We shouldn't represent the Godhead with anything that is pretty much tangible or visible. So what should we look at to see what the Godhead is like? Well, when you go to Romans chapter 1, it tells us in Romans 1 that as we look at nature, in verse 20, nature shows us what the Godhead is like. So as you look at God's handiwork in creation, in nature, we can see that it reflects the artist, which is God. That's how we're meant to see the Godhead, not through art or man's device or images, right? So to wrap this up, we're going to Exodus chapter 20. Now, Exodus chapter 20 is the 10 commandments. And in the 10 commandments, when you look at the second of the 10, Look at what it says. It says, thou shalt not make, verse 4, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. What's the issue? The issue here is that those that hate God, they make images or carve out trees or whatever it is, and they worship them. God says, don't do this, right? Don't carve out these things and worship these things, because then we're not worshiping him anymore. The reason that these things were frowned upon by early Protestant is because in the Catholic Church, they worship these images. God says we should not worship them. The issue is not Christmas or Easter or the tree. The issue is, are you going to put man's commandment above God's commandment? And as long as you don't do that, you're fine, that you're safe. That's a safety. You know, if you're going to use Christmas as a day to help people that are less fortunate and so forth, and family time and so forth, there's nothing wrong with it. But don't worship the thing. Worship God. And as always, keep fighting for the truth.